So, I want to call this series of video casts I'm doing called Reading the Way of Things, which is, of course, the title of my book. But I want to frame it as, a series of, potentially infinite series of takes, spins, reading anything, from a film to a martini glass, to a philosopher, to a concept. Because I like to have a cocktail while I'm sitting thinking, I'm drinking today is some Occitan gin, which is funny, is like Italian gin. Go figure. It's super affordable, Occitan gin, and super tasty. It's my favorite everyday gin. It's basically it's like a more citrusy London Dry. It's not so juniper-y. I'm just drinking it on the rocks with some soda and a very fancy maraschino cherry. This is my go-to drink. This or tequila and soda. Often. Okay, so today I want to talk about reading the way of affect. And affect is I want to say it's an idea, but it's not necessarily an idea. But it's a figure that's featured prominently in my thinking and in my talking. And recently, over the past year, I've had a lot of interest in it. More people coming out of mostly thanks to Thaddeus Russell and Unregistered Podcast. A lot of people asking me about affect and excited and interested in it. And it is in a way, to me, perhaps the most exciting thing that got introduced into my life that really began to reorient fundamentally how I think, what I think knowledge is, what I think perception is, how the world works. That the absence of this figure of affect from our public discourse, from how we think about things, is a real detriment, is a real problem for knowledge, for science, for medicine, for interpersonal relationships, for really how we think about ourselves and the world and how we come to know it. So what is this thing, affect? This thing that Deleuze talks about, that Deleuze and Guattari talk about. What is affect? I'm going to give, in a way, a very simple definition that I think hopefully will make it really clear. Affect is the invisible state of things. It's the invisible state of a thing. What does that mean? Well, picture any given thing. Picture a room. Let's say you're apartment hunting and you're checking out some new apartment and you walk in and you see, you open the door and you see this living room. You can already begin to account for the visible state of things, right? You can say, well, oh yeah, I like the 11-foot high ceilings. I like the beams. I like the depth of the room. Or I don't like the depth. It's too skinny a room. I like the colors. I like the light. I can account for all the visual elements, and no doubt those are crucial. All right, it's how we make sense of the world. It's how we navigate the world. But when you're looking at an apartment, right? That there's something else. You're like, you come back and your friend will say, well, you looked at the apartment today. What was it like? You're like, yeah, small, but it had a really nice feel. That's, or it seemed great, but something was off about it. What is that nice feel or something off about it? Well, that I want to suggest is affect. And that's the invisible state of things. And things have extension, physical extension in the world, right? They have length, width, depth. They have things you can measure and things you can perceive with our five senses, the ones we already know, right? And that means things we can measure. I can measure the room this way and that. I can measure the intensity of the light. There's things I can visually account for. But we also perceive something else, right? We perceive these other traits, right, that can't be measured and can't be seen. They can't be touched. They can't be smelled. They can't be felt with our fingers. And yet we perceive it, right? What this tells me is a couple of things. It tells me, first of all, that our assumptions about perception are quite limited. That if we assume that there are five senses and that's how we sense the world and how we perceive the world, well, that's just not quite right? Because, again, I walk in a room and I'm apartment hunting and I'm perceiving that room with clearly more than that. But I can walk out of there and say it had a funny feel. What is it? What sense is it that has said that has a funny feel? How have I attained that knowledge? I'm not giving you an answer. I'm just suggesting that we sense differently than through a series of 5 discrete senses, right? I'm not sure that any sense is ever really discrete, right? There's always a kind of synesthesia between our senses, and they all work together as a perceiving body. I'm a body that perceives. And just as, let's say, I look at those beautiful 11-foot ceilings and those wood beams, which I do not have in my place, and that when I look at it, the light makes an impression on my eye, and I perceive those wood beams and those 11-foot ceilings. In the same sense, when the room has a certain feel to it, right? An affect is something we perceive. It makes an impression on us, quite literally, right? It impresses upon us. Where and how, I don't know. It's interacting with a different body than our rational body. Deleuze and Guattari were talking about the body without organs, and I don't want to get into that. But I want to suggest that there's an organization of the body according to a certain schematic of these senses, and each one has its specialization. Right? It just clearly smacks of a certain understanding of capitalist production, right? Of factories, industrial production, everything in its place, and all working towards the whole. Clearly, perception works in a different way than that, in a more complicated fashion, or maybe less complicated fashion, but definitely a different fashion than that. So affect is the invisible state of a thing. It's a kind of perception and knowledge that we take for granted, really, in day-to-day life. We'll say, hey, have you been to that restaurant? You'd be like, yeah, the food's good, but I don't know, place is depressing to me. Or, you walk in a bar for the first time. Yes, I know, I come back to bars often. It's one of the few public venues that I partake of from time to time when I decide to actually leave my house. And you say, a bar has a great feel, or that bar is depressing. And no doubt there are various things we can point to. It's well lit, it's not well lit. Either natural light, or I like the ambient lighting. I say this about a few times I've been to Los Angeles, everything there is so well lit. I think they have so much extra, filmmaking talent, set design and lighting production. Everything, might be in a shitty ass bar, but man, it's well lit. That threw me off at first, because I'd walk in a bar and be like, oh, I really like this. But I was perceiving and relating back to my previous experiences of good lighting. But in LA, that begins to shift. What counts as your affective mechanisms need to shift. Your affective perceptive mechanisms need to shift, right? But everything's so well lit there. And no doubt we judge that new apartment we're looking at, that bar, that restaurant, by our so-called normal perception, the extension in space. We'll say, it has great light, natural, ambient. It has the booze I like. It has the good food. But then we begin talking about something else, flow. And I don't want to talk about feng shui because I don't know shit about it. I know it's highly schematic, but I like sort of the westernization or bastardization of this very esoteric kind of knowledge of feng shui, which is, again, I know nothing about it except a sort of popularization of it, but it talks about, I think, kind of affective flow. What is the speed of energy? Is your desk in a certain part of the room, right? You have your back to it. And we know that feeling of feeling funny if our back is maybe to an open door, right? Something feels, again, off about it. There is a flow of something happening. And I want to say that thing is affect. Affect is the invisible state of things. And everything, all things are affective. One way to think about affect is mood. And it is distinctly not emotion. I think often when we think of affect, it gets reduced to emotions. But emotions are, they're human or they're animal. It's an animal experience of a particular body. I feel sad. The dog looks sad. And that's emotion, right? It's a subjective experience, right? It's an experience of a particular body. Affect is not human. It is ahuman. It is an intraspecial, or not just special, because it also pervades rocks, it pervades all things, calculators and books and tables and staplers and pens and computers. There's nothing in the world that doesn't have affect. And that is true not just of things that are spatial, such as objects, but also ideas. A lot of invisible things, concepts, ideas, notions, are themselves affective. They have a certain affective way about them. They have a certain state of intensity that exceeds or can't be reduced to something that can be measured or conceptualized. There's another experience of it. I mean, one thing, think about the will to power. Who doesn't love to say the will to power? Forget for a moment what the will to power might mean and all the terrible ways it's been interpreted and read, and all the beautiful ways it's been interpreted and read. Just saying the will to power has a certain affective resonance, right? It's just sort of fun to say. And no doubt ideas function that way. I stumbled a bunch of years ago, just through my Twitter and all that, by a whole movement that seems to be in the academy called object-oriented ontology, triple O or OOO. And I remember I saw the big O's written, and I looked it up, and I was like, oh my. This is what Merleau-Ponty, this is what Deleuze. I've been talking about this for 30 years. I don't get what's happening here. But the fact is, calling it object-oriented ontology, that triple O, man, it feels good. It looks good. It's cool. It's cool. I personally don't find it cool, but it is cool. And that, in fact, brings me to another point, which is that I think the inheritance we have from sort of Enlightenment thinking is that there's the objective world, which is spatial, right? It can be measured. It can be length, width, depth, height. It has a weight. It has a temperature. It has a color, and that any other experience of it is subjective. Right? That we can all look at the same book, but we're all going to feel a different thing. And that's just not right, right? I want to say that affect is in fact objective. It is in the world. It is out here. It is not here. The subjective is what's inside of me, a very private internal experience. And I can have a private experience of affect, no doubt. But I have a private experience of affect just as I have a private experience of the gin, right? You're drinking a gin, I'm drinking a gin, but we react to it differently. We enjoy it differently. We can both point to certain objective states of it. We can say it has more or less juniper, more or less citrusy, more or less bright. But our reaction to it and our judgment of it and our respective enjoyment or lack thereof of it will, of course, differ, right? Because we are bodies and it's a body and bodies go differently together, right? I drop a glass on a pillow, it doesn't break. I drop a glass on pavement, it breaks, right? Different bodies go differently together. That is objective. Again, the experience of the affect will be particular and perspectival, meaning from my perspective, the resonance of this affect is such and such. But the affect is in the world. It is not a private subjective experience. It is objective. It is objective as the sort of dimensions of a thing. It is as objective as the length, width, depth, and height that I can ruler out, right? That no one would disagree. Yeah, that's 11.5 inches. And everyone would say, yep, that's what the ruler says. The same is true of affect. Affect is in the world, although it can't be measured. But it is there. I mean, that's why we go in a bar and be like, yeah, this bar feels funny, right? Again, for certain people, they might say, you might be with me like, yeah, I see what you're saying, but I like that, or it works well for me. Back to the bar example. I've been in old school sort of real drinker bars, kind of bars that open at 6 a.m. And I've been in those, and there's something sort of dank, right? There's something sort of repressive about them, right, or depressive about them. And so I don't like that. I generally don't enjoy those bars, although I have at certain times and places. It's the perfect thing. It works with the flow that I'm in and need and crave and yearn for, and serves my vitality. I think the people who are drinking there and drink there every day wouldn't disagree with my assessment. They would just disagree with the judgment of it. And they would say, well, that's how I go with it. Right? We both agree to the state, to the invisible state of that particular space, of that particular bar, to its affect. But we'll still have particular experiences of it. Of course we will. We all have particular experiences of everything. So affect is the invisible state of things, including invisible things like ideas and concepts, but that gets sort of complicated, so I'm going to put that aside for now. Let's just stick to things and say that everything is affective. Another way to say this is, I think, and someone might call me out and say it's not quite the same thing, but I want to say everything is mooded. There's no such thing as an object that is, an object being man-made or not, a tree is an object, that isn't mooded. The world is always already mooded. There's no way to avoid it, right? Think about different computers. Think about why we choose different colors of our Macs and the difference between a Mac and whatever the fuck, a little Google Chromebook or a black IBM thing. We can compare all their specs. They'll be more or less similar, advantages, disadvantages. But there's going to be something else that distinguishes those three different computers, right? If nothing else, besides their functionality and their speeds and all the things we can measure, there's going to be something else. And that something else is affect, right? Affect is, at some point, seems coextensive with the physicality of it, meaning the sort of shiny steel of my little MacBook Air here. The mood begins and ends with that steel, right? Let's say that's true for this particular Apple, meaning that the affect of a thing, the invisible state of it, and the physical state of it are their boundaries are the same. Now, I'm going to say that's not always true and often not true, but let's say for right now, sometimes they are true, especially with sort of banal objects, right? So if I take a stapler and I put it in my living room, and then I put it in some mansion living room, and I put it in a old drinker's bar, and I put it in the cool bar, and I put it on the beach, the affect of that thing will change somewhat, but not that much. And yet, the invisible state and the visible states of things might be coextensive, meaning they map to each other, but they're not the same, right? I can describe a space, a room, an object, by its measurable traits, right? I can be incredibly elaborate and thorough in how I talk about that thing, the kind of data it gives me. There will always be something else, right? None of those quantitative states, none of those things we can measure and see, touch, smell, hear, whatever, hear, listen, whatever the fuck it is, there will be an experience of that thing, of that stapler, of that computer, of that bar that will not be able to be defined by those things, by those quantitative things, right? And sometimes we could say there's always a remainder. This kind of thing Derrida would say, right? There's this remainder, there's this excess that this kind of knowledge can't account for. But I don't see it that way. I don't see it as excess. On the contrary, I see the affective states of things as constitutive of a thing, and as constitutive of it as its materiality, as its metals and its wires and its plastics and its colors and its, whatever else it has. Right? The affect runs through it and can't be reduced to the physical, traditionally spatially extensive nature of a thing. It's space here. But it is, even when coextensive, it is something else. It's another piece of data. So just as I walk in a room and I want to measure it and see if it's going to fit all my stuff, and if I like it, I like length, width, height, where am I going to put the bed, where am I going to put the bookcases? There's something else I'm measuring all the time, and that is the mood. Right? That is the affect of that space. Right? It is another piece of data. It is another aspect of that thing. Right? It's how it feels. So affect is the invisible state of a thing. It is objective, even if perspectivally particular, right? It's going to interact with each person differently, each thing differently, right? But it's objective, it's in the world. It's objective, like when I go to a movie and it's a sad movie, everyone feels that sadness, right? I mean, everyone feels that mood. We might not all have the same judgment. We might not react in the same ways. I mean, I'll be watching a comedy and everyone in the theater might be laughing. And I'm not laughing because I don't think it's funny, but I know that it is something of humor. I recognize the funniness, even if I don't find it funny, right? The funniness is objective. Whether I personally find it something worthy of my laughter is something else entirely. So affect is the invisible state of things. It is objective. It is can be coextensive with a thing, but that a thing, whatever it is, cannot be reduced to its visible traits. That there will always, everything is mooded. There is no way to escape mood. Mood is as constitutive of the world as matter, right? There's no getting rid of mood. You can't strip it away. And here's where it begins to get a little, I think beautiful, and maybe a little complicated in that often, while the mood of something might be coextensive with the physicality of it, right? Meaning it begins and ends with that room I'm in, which is already interesting because it means affect is spatial, right? Or begins and ends with that stapler, that computer, right? The affect of my Mac book ends at the borders of the object, right? But affect exceeds particular things, right? The air, what we call the air, the world between spatial things, between me and you, between me and this gin bottle, between me and my cocktail, me and the computer, between the computer and my cocktail. That is not empty space, right? Affect saturates everything, right? Between objects in the world, between the stars and the moons and the planets, between me and you, between the cushion and the floor, is stuff. It is infinitely rich. And it is infinitely rich with lots of things, including affect. Affect is a human, right? If emotion is a human thing, humans feel sad or angry. But affect is more peculiar than that. Affect is more... affect tears at language, right? It tears at our ability to describe it and name it. It coates and it borders on the ineffable. Right? We can perform the affect, right? But we can't always describe it. So its ineffability is in our ability to describe it because it is purely experiential. So our language can perform it and give the experience of it, but not necessarily describe it. So I want to say that affect flows between us, flows between and amongst everything, and comes from all things. So there are all kinds of flows from sun flares and supernovas and dust and aliens zipping through outer space and the glimmer of moon in the clouds, not to mention, some TV show that's on and some news you heard and the tears of a child, and all these things are floating through and we get taken up in them and participate in them. What do I mean by that? I think we know this all the time, right? We'll be, wake up in the morning and just be possessed by a mood. You wake up sad, you wake up feeling invigorated, you wake up with some sense of foreboding, you wake up with a sense of unsettledness. What do you think? Where does that come from? I would say it comes from a world that exceeds us, a world in which we participate, and we help shape that affect, but often that affect is quite powerful. I want to say mood and affect are perhaps the most powerful forces in the universe. We know this, we know this from our experience. Emerson says, is one of my favorite quotes of all time, our moods don't believe in each other. The moods don't believe in each other. When you're depressed, fuck, everything sucks. It just is bad. The world is hopeless. That is despair. And you can't imagine it can be any other way or will be any other way. It's not always the case, but that is what depression is. It is so thorough, so pervasive, right? It runs through every molecule and every gesture of thought and perception, such that everything gets defined by it. And you can't imagine ever having been happy or that you'll ever be happy again. You don't believe in each other, right? You don't believe the other state can even exist. And mood is very, very powerful in these affective flows, and they, as affect is constitutive of all matter, and flows through everything throughout the cosmos, through all that space. You look up in the sky, it is affective, to greater, lesser degrees of intensity. But the whole world is affective, just as, let's say, when our sun explodes, it's going to affect us. Right? That's going to be a big cosmic event that is going to blow our minds. Of course, we won't be here. Human beings won't be around, but you understand what I'm saying. Well, there are all kinds of affective explosions, all kinds of affective flows and forces, right? Just like a wind, just like a storm that can blow through and take you up. And we know this. We know this because sometimes we wake up and sometimes we just feel good and sometimes we don't feel good. And sometimes we feel unsettled and sometimes we feel anxious and sometimes we feel excited and anticipatory. Sometimes it's a mix of all of these things. And it's coming from the inside and it's coming from the outside. It's coming from the space between us, which is drenched with affect. I used to do this thing, which I still sometimes do, is I call it an affect walk. When I'll go for a walk, and what I really try to heed is the affect, right? So I'll be walking down my street, and the trees and the certain pavement, it'll be very gentle and quaint, and I'll turn the corner, I'll have this air sort of malaise or depression, and then I'll come around another corner, and it'll be sort of giddy and happy, and I could begin to quantify why or how certain areas shift. But again, they'll never account for the shifting of mood as you make your way. You should try it sometime. It's an incredible experience. If all you do is tune in, all you do is tune in to the affect of wherever you are, however you're going through, in yourself, in your own space, in your house, on your street, just walking through a city, start sensing the affective flows. I always hope that architects learn this. I look at buildings that get put up in the city, and I'm like, no architect. They just, whatever architect built that did not consider the architecture of the invisible, did not consider the architecture of the invisible, the architectures of affect. They consider, and the flow of affect. They considered, well, we have X, amount of square feet, and we need to create X number of units at X, X price point. And that's how they go about. And they have materials, and they can measure and do weights, but they're not thinking about fucking affect. And then you find architects that clearly did. And you walk in, you're like, oh, this space feels nice. And you can even think about something like Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim in New York, which is sort of a ridiculous space to see art, right? You're on a slant. It's really not made for art. He really privileged affect and the flow of affect over the experience of looking at the art. So, a conspicuous thing about the Guggenheim is that the affect of the building often over exceeds or over dominates the affect of a particular work of art. And it's a funny thing about that building, right? It really amped up the affective quality of it. It's actually not ideal for viewing art. Duh, it's round, you're in an angle, you can see kind of what's up ahead. It's, right? So I want to say that affect, which permeates all things, all between us all, right? That it functions as a kind of, as a communicative layer between people, but also between people and non-people and the inhuman, meaning both animals and inanimate objects. How do we communicate with our pets? How do we communicate with an animal? You got your dog, your cat. You feel so much with this cat, right? And some of that can be a very private, subjective thing, as the cat somehow represents your childhood. But that does not, in any sense, exhaust what's actually happening between you and that cat, between you and that animal, right? The extraordinary thing about interacting with an animal is this affective back and forth, is this kind of, they sense you, you sense them. How does a dog know when you're upset? I mean, this is a thing pet owners, dog owners talk about all the time. You know, the person's on the couch looking forlorn, all of a sudden the dog comes up and, you know, licks their face. How do they know? How do you know how the dog feels? How do I know when my son's lying here that I think he's a little anxious or upset? I feel it. I perceive it because that information is fucking right there. We feel it. We know it. It's available. It's making itself known if you touch it and feel it. How is that happening? How is that happening? Well, I want to say it's happening because the world is a plenum, right? And I get this from reading Leibniz's great book, The Monadology. Leibniz is a 17th century philosopher. He invented differential calculus, I believe, simultaneous with whoever the fuck else did, Newton. Leibniz says the world is a plenum. Plenum is Plenum, plenum. It is absolutely full. There is no such thing as nothing. There's no empty space between things. For Leibniz, the world is like, it's tessellated in a sense, right? It's interlocked. There's no gap between bodies. And he calls these things monads, and they all run up against each other. And what happens when everything is touching everything else and there's no extra space? Well, when this thing moves, right, this monad, this moves, and everything else around it moves. Right? It is literally a communication, right, of vibration, or it's a spatial communication, right? One thing moves, everything else moves. That's the way in a plenum. Now, if we believe in something called a vacuum, which the Enlightenment ended up really doubling down on, then there's empty space between you and I can just sort of spin in space and I don't affect anything else. But in a plenum, every gesture, every movement is affecting everything else to a greater or lesser degree. And I want to say that the world is a plenum of affect. Affect runs through. We're saturated with it. It doesn't mean it can be quite intense at times and quite vague at other times. But it's still always there. There's no space, no thing, not any moment in the universe that is not affective. Well, that means that any affective shift here shifts the other affects, right? There's this constant sort of nudging. So when I'm interacting with an animal, we are participating in a common substance, right? In the affective ether, if you will, right? In a kind of plasma. That's why I really picture affect as a plasma layer, right? That allows this constant sort of communication, these vibratory communications of a certain kind of information and a certain kind of experience that I'm calling affect. That's how we communicate with dogs and cats and animals and birds and trees. Trees, man, trees are so affective and they communicate to us and we communicate with them. And this is in fact the very possibility of empathy. I don't think empathy is something added on to a situation. I think empathy is inherent in life, right? That empathy is not, I'm knowing, it's not the traversal of subjective states that I have to go inside your head. It's quite the contrary. It's that we are like both on a common rug, right? So you nudge the rug, I nudge too, right? And we'll move slightly differently. Your gesture might be quite extreme, and I might, the rug might be quite large, and by the time that ripple hits me, I barely move. But I did move, and your movement and my movement were intimately intertwined in a common space, even if our perspectives and our respective experiences are quite different. There's also this commonality. There's also this coextensivity, this co-experience, which is compassion or empathy. And that's how I want to imagine empathy. That empathy is actually just, empathy has a lot of valence today in today's political and business world, design world talks a lot about empathy. And we talk about empathy can be taught, and we look for cues and clues and things. But I want to suggest we are always already empathetic. That's how we know. We know when our lover, our children, or our family members, our friends are feeling funny, that they're feeling funky. We know their emotional state, because their emotional state becomes their affective state, right? And when we participate in that common affective state, right? We might not name it correctly, but we know something's happening. So culturally, what we call empathy is really just the dialing up of this particular sense. That right now the Enlightenment tends to, our Enlightenment thinking, our scientific thinking, our cultural thinking, explicitly privileges the quantifiable, the extensive things I can see, smell, touch, taste, right? I know I'm probably missing a sense, right? Those 5 senses. But we are always feeling, to some degree, the affective flow, which I want to call empathy, right? This nudge of other people. And we can dial that up. We can say, that is a sense I want to pay more attention to. And that's when someone becomes empathetic, when they're heeding that. And some people aren't so good at it, right? That's the sociopath, I suppose, right? Doesn't feel what other people feel. They're lacking a sense. They're like blind or deaf people, right? Often we don't have a sense. Some people lack that sense, right? I think it is. I want what I'm saying to be sort of rational, right? It's not some mystical thing, right? It is just a piece of data that is right there for the taking. It's being presented to us all the time, but for some reason it's been left out of so much of our knowledge, our medicine, our science, our engineering, our architecture, right? And how we explicitly talk about human relations, right? We don't talk about them in terms of, often in terms of affect. So I want to suggest that, or what I'm saying, how I'm defining this, is that affect is the invisible state of things, okay? Everything, visible and invisible, but let's just talk about the visible things. Everything in the world is affective. There's no such thing as something that is just doesn't have an affect, doesn't have a mood. Everything is mooded. Everything is mooded. There's a great book of poetry by someone who happens to be my good friend and also a colleague. We studied together for many years, Poetical Dictionary by Lauren Green, in which he writes a dictionary. And his argument in the book is that words are affective, right? They have a meaning, but they also have a sense. They have a mood to them, right? That a word cannot be reduced to its conceptual meaning. There's another aspect to a word, to all words. That is their affect. It is what Lauren Green calls their sense. Right? So he creates. It's really a dictionary, right? I mean, here's the definition of hand. Here's doodle. Right? Looks like a doodle. But it is the definition, right? Bleak is a good one. Here's bleak. All right. Bleak. Withdraw the tongue from a flattened smile. bleak, and gives the pronunciation. Adjective, Middle English, bleke, pale, perhaps from Old English, blaken to bleach. So he gives the etymology just like a dictionary. Here's the definition. Devoid of prospect, a dying across a wind-nulled place, depleting there in trembles like a trumpet note, left in emptiness, hanging and bent. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? Why am I talking about this? Because what Green gives us here is knowledge, information, in which affect is constitutive, in which things are not just reduced to their concept or their physical state, but affect is folded into the knowledge set, right? There's another book, he wrote a textbook called Atmospherics, which is the constitution of the affective plane, right? In which he really begins to account for and explain, again, a phrase I come back to, the architectures of the invisible. I was recently looking at the beautiful sort of wired, I think they're wired, kind of hanging sculptures of this great artist, Ruth Asawa. And hopefully I'll be able to get some pictures in here of her work, in which there's some in the DeYoung Museum here in San Francisco. If you see the picture, you'll probably recognize them. But it's only occurred to me that what she's doing is making visible invisibles of the architecture, these kind of flows of affect and mood that inhabit our space, that amongst which we dwell. Affect then is it's almost like I want to call it invisible matter, but that's absurd because matter is precisely that which is visible. But I want to think about it almost as that. It is a kind of stuff, albeit invisible. And it is sensed despite its invisibility, despite that I can't smell it, see it, taste it, hear it, or touch it. I perceive it. It makes an impression on me. We know this all the time. We know this when we go through the world. We know when we walk in a room, when we meet a new person, we're like, yeah, he had a good energy. Right? We have these other ways of saying about it. Yeah, he seemed off. He seemed sad. We get a lot of information that can't be quantified. It makes literally an impression on us all the time. What I want to do is elevate this perceptive faculty in us and see what happens to our knowledge base when affect is constitutive of it and not reduced to a private subjective experience. So again, affect is the invisible state of things that pervades all things, that runs through things, that even it wraps up multiple things in its wake, and carries us along, that it forms a kind of communicative layer, this sort of communicative plasma through which human and inhuman objects and bodies interact with each other, right? Creating possibilities of co-knowing or knowing together, and because we share a kind of a flow, a common gunk of plasma, and that it saturates everything. Affect is not something added to an experience. It's something that can be figured and manipulated. So that's sort of what I'm calling for, is an elevation of it, right? It's a great experience. Watch a movie and track its affect. Go for a walk and note the affect of the trees, the architecture of the roads, and then you begin to wonder, how did this happen? How did they build this? How did that ever happen? I could see on paper, quantitatively, why it made sense, but affectively, how did this happen? This happens all the time in a city. Like, where am I right now? Right? It's just poorly designed. I can see structurally and practically and rationally how it ended up there. But once I elevate affect to, and I count for affect, and I elevate it in my own sort of perception and in my own knowing, I believe that knowledge fundamentally changes how I know myself, and how I know myself in the world fundamentally changes, such as affect.